Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopez, and today I'm here with Dr. Jessica Pierce. She is an American bioethicist, philosopher, and writer. She currently has a loose affiliation with the Center for Bioethics and Humanities at the University of Colorado, Denver, but considers herself mostly independent. She has previously worked variously at the University of Colorado Boulder, the University of Nebraska Medical Center, and Randolph-Macon Women's College. Early in her career, she focused on questions of human health and the environment, co-authoring Environmentalism and the New Logic of Business and the Ethics of Environmentally Responsible Healthcare. Since the 2000s, much of her work has focused on human relationships with animals. She collaborated with Marc Bekoff for Wild Justice and authored The Last Walk, Run, Spot, Run, and more recently, The Animals Agenda. So, Dr. Pierce, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
You're most welcome. Nice to be here.
Okay, great. So the first question I would like to ask you, since today we're going to focus our conversation mostly on animal ethics and several different topics that are related to it, what is the importance of fields like biology and comparative and evolutionary psychology and even neuroscience to animal ethics?
So in my opinion, what we can learn from these fields is really essential to doing animal ethics well. I don't think it's specific to animal ethics. I think coming from bioethics, my take on ethics is that it's very practical and contextual based. That's really what bioethics is. It's about doing ethics kind of at the intersection of a humanistic field and scientific field. So, we're really, you can't do bioethics well without understanding human medicine and healthcare systems. And I think the same is true with animals. And just to give you an example, in trying to establish some guidelines about welfare and what animals need, the animals under our care, we have to know who they are and what their biological drives are, what they feel, why they feel what they do when they feel, so that we can to respond appropriately. To give a really specific example, as a dog owner, it's really important for me to understand what is going on in my dog's mind and nose in order to give her a good life. Knowing, for example, that dogs really live through their noses and through a sense of smell. I know that it's important to, when we take a walk, she gets to set the pace and spend as much time sniffing as she wants to. So that's a practical example of why, and I don't think we'd know that if we, didn't do research on dog sensory experience of the world. So I think the science is really essential, and understanding, for example, that animals have emotions is of profound importance to animal ethics, and that comes straight from cognitive ethology and the study of animal minds. So I really don't think you could do animal ethics well or live with an animal well without knowing something about the science of what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Right. And what are the parts of animal psychology that we have to consider when we're thinking about perhaps classifying a particular animal as a moral entity, perhaps at the same level of human beings?
I think I would qualify at the same level as human beings, and just to emphasize that each animal species is really unique in how they interact with the world and interact with each other. And one of the things that has really stymied animal ethics and also animal science is taking humans as the gold standard and saying, this is how intelligence works, or this is how emotions work, and then comparing animals to that and saying, oh, well, animals just don't quite measure up, because we're using this human lens to assess their behavior. And a perfect example of this is this so-called mirror test for self-awareness. So, for a long time, scientists were sort of fiddling with this idea that if an animal can recognize him or herself in a mirror, they have self-awareness. So they put a red dot on the forehead of an elephant and put an elephant in front of a mirror and say, does the elephant recognize him or herself? And, that's a really limited way to assess whether an elephant has self-awareness, because that may just not be ecologically relevant for an elephant, the mirror or the red dot on their head. So I think trying to understand animals on their own terms is critical. I'm not sure I actually answered your original question. But so which aspects of animal minds and feelings do we need to get a handle on? And I don't know if you want to start getting into moral behavior in animals right now, just jump right into that.
Well, perhaps relating to animal morality, is it really important for us to know if a particular animal exhibits some sort of moral behavior when deciding how we should treat it?
I don't think so, because, I think that moral behaviors in animals are, they're one aspect of how animals interact with each other. And you're going to see this suite of behaviors that we write about in Wild Justice in animals for whom sociality is really important. And so if you used the capacity for morality as a measure of who has moral worth, then you're going to have a really small subset of animals who we say have value. And it is the way we tend to do things. We say, well, and maybe, it kind of makes sense to go that way, because, if you say that the capacity for moral behavior requires a certain level of cognitive complexity and some self-awareness and some ability to future forecast, and so all of these other kind of complex cognitive and emotional capacities, those are the animals that we tend to find it easiest to ascribe moral value to. And I'm thinking particularly of chimpanzees, and people have more scruples when it comes to how we interact with chimpanzees, because they are so much like us, and it's so obvious the ways in which they're like us. I think it'd be unfortunate for the masses of creatures out there who don't possess this subset of skills, say, well, they don't have as much moral value, and so I'm not sure I'd want to go down that path, although I think it intuitively is compelling in certain respects.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and it's also not really important if another animal from another species is able to reciprocate their moral behavior, right?
Right. And, I think we do the same thing with humans. We don't say, because an infant doesn't have the capacity for, complex moral behavior, they have less value than, you or I, or a person with advanced dementia. You don't just write them off and say, well, they can't interact with us in ways that we recognize, so they don't matter. I mean, I think there is a reason why populations like people with dementia are considered vulnerable, though, because we do have a tendency to pay less attention to their needs. So there's a sense in which they need greater protection, and maybe that's true for animals too. The lesser among them, if you'll excuse the phrase, may need greater protections.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and it's interesting that earlier you referred to the fact that perhaps sometimes we try to evaluate other animals from a moral perspective, taking a human stance or sort of a human perspective, that is evaluating them according to our own human standards. Because, I mean, even when it comes to determining if another species has some sort of consciousness or not, or what degree of consciousness does another species have or not, I mean, is it really important, even if we were to know that other species didn't really have consciousness? Because, I mean, we know at least that certain animals are able to exhibit complex behavior, and we don't really have that much evidence that they are really conscious of what they're doing. But even if that's the case, is it really that important?
I don't think it is. I think you're right that it isn't the measure that we should use to give someone respect or moral value. And, you know, as soon as we think we understand everything, then we have more information. And I think a rather intriguing example of this is the case of insects. So you think of insects as these little creatures that really don't have any feelings or much going on up there. But the more we're learning about insects, the more amazing they seem. I mean, they really do have quite complex mental lives, I guess you could say. And so the phrase insect cognition, which 10 years ago people might have laughed at, now is a real thing. So I think, you know, you draw this line at where who has consciousness, or, you know, where, you know, that's this sort of scale of being, and you better draw with a pencil because you're going to have to erase it and fix it based on new information. And we don't discover that animals have less going on than we thought. We are always discovering that there's more going on than we thought. So I think we should, the sort of burden of proof should be on us to really make sure that we aren't making assumptions about the simplicity or lack of something in other animals. It's really what it is a test of how intelligent we are and how good our research methods are and what we're willing and able to see. So.
Yeah. And how important is it for us to really know the set of moral behaviors that other species have and exhibit? I mean, and from a philosophical perspective, because I guess that we can get into it from a scientific perspective and simply describing their behavior, but what kind of implications might it have for ethics in this case?
So, I mean, I think it has really interesting implications for animal ethics, you know, for how we interact with animals, and also for thinking about ourselves and our own moral behavior. One thing that's been really clear in the last decade or so, maybe a little bit longer, in moral philosophy is this. There's been a lot more work in what is called empirical ethics or empirical moral philosophy, where people aren't just, you know, like the old philosophers like Kant and Hegel, just trying to describe the world as they see it and kind of come up with this, sort of impose this structure on the human brain or on human social organization, or who I am. Actually looking at what the brains of people who are engaging in moral thought, what's going on neurologically. And also, I think what we're discovering is that, I mean, I can't put a number on it, but 90%, just to give a guess, of what we call moral behavior is actually kind of under the radar of our consciousness. So, you're nice because it's instinctive for you to be nice and to be socially tolerant of other people, not because you made a conscious decision, not to push the lady down on the bus next to you or whatever it was. It flows naturally from who we are as animals. And I think looking at evolution at moral behavior as an evolved strategy, that, and evolution doesn't typically do things once in one species. I mean, things that are successful occur broadly. And I think that's the case with moral behavior. I mean, it's an evolved strategy for living successfully in large groups. And it works really well most of the time. With lots of room for failure. And maybe humans fail more often than animals do. I don't know. But I think it helps us see how natural moral behavior is for us, that it's not this kind of veneer that we impose on top of this otherwise really selfish, brutal nature, but something that has been evolving in us for a long, long time. And the implication for animal ethics, I think, is really important because, we have a tendency to kind of put up these barriers between humans and other animals to distinguish us from them, what makes humans unique, and usually as a kind of excuse for exploiting other animals or using them for our purposes, say, well, we're different and better. And morality is one of those things that has been used as kind of a wedge. Well, humans have it and other animals don't. But, if other animals also have these complex social lives going on, and a lot going on in here, then I think it ups the ante in the discussion about according them more moral value.
Mm-hmm. So would it be a fair assessment to say that until very recently, from an historical perspective, what people did in philosophy was mostly derived from intuitions that philosophers had about human morality and how humans behaved, and perhaps how we could change their behavior for the better or something like that. And then more recently, with biology and psychology exploring the evolved basis of our morality, our and other animals' morality, of course, that it really sheds a new light on where our morality comes from, how it really works, and really perhaps what are the limits for its plasticity, let's say, when we're trying to change it. And so it really gives us better, more solid tools to even understand ourselves a little bit better. Would that be a fair assessment?
Well, I think so, at least partly. And I'd add the caveat here that I don't spend a lot of time sort of reading heavily in the field of philosophy because what I read is science, mostly. Mm-hmm. My impression of contemporary philosophy is that it is, so there's what I had referenced a few minutes ago, this kind of empirical branch of moral philosophy that's doing really interesting work, and people who are thinking about climate change. And then there are philosophers who really are doing this very kind of abstract, just kind of when you think of the philosopher with a beard and sitting in a room thinking about, I am, what does that mean for the world? And in some ways less historically grounded, or less grounded in an understanding of history than some of the older philosophers. But I think the empirical work and the overlap, I think there's a lot more interdisciplinary work in philosophy than there used to be. Actually, now that I say that, that may not be true, because philosophers, 300 years ago would have been very closely sort of also political philosophers and, scientists and theologians. And so I'm not sure that's accurate, but the interdisciplinary work now with neuroscience and social psychologists, I think, is really interesting and important. Again, I'm not sure I actually answered your question, but in a very roundabout way, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. And we've already talked about consciousness here. Do you think that it's also important for us to really know if other animals have an emotion like empathy, if they are able to feel empathy for fellow beings of their species, or even even animals from other species, like when we have mutualism or something like that, and that really perhaps empathy is another thing that was put in a pedestal and associated exclusively to human beings, but perhaps other animals also have it. But I mean, perhaps there's two questions here. One, the last part that I said about empathy also being put on a pedestal, and perhaps it's not really the case, all other animals have it. And the second part, if they have it or they don't, is that really important, again, from a moral standpoint?
So I think yes to both of those questions. And, in terms of, understanding whether animals do and kind of how we get at that, Darwin himself pretty clearly thought animals have empathy. He didn't use that language, but sympathy, compassion for each other, fellow feeling. And so it's not a new idea. I think it sort of went out of favor for a while, and especially during the phase of behaviorism, where animals were seen as these kind of black boxes, and there was input and output. And in the last 10 years really has been, I think, a sea change in a sort of openness to using that language, empathy, and in studying animals. It's still, when you read a study about chimpanzees having empathy, everybody's pretty willing to accept that. But, the studies on mouse empathy and rat empathy, I think people have a harder time accepting that research and accepting the use of language in that context, just because of stereotypes about these animals. And so I think that's been one useful thing about the empathy research, is just kind of cracking some of these stereotypes about who animals are and which animals have these sorts of capacities. In terms of how we treat animals, I think it's really important to know if and that. I'm not sure it's an if anymore. It's a that animals have empathic feelings for each other, because, if you take one example, it's a little gruesome, but I think it's a useful example. they've done studies of rats who are being used in scientific experiments, and there's something called witnessing effects. So they'll study, stress levels of rats after they've witnessed another one of their cage mates being decapitated, and stress levels go up. So if you know that rats have a capacity for empathy and you're trying to treat them well, and you're still going to research on them, at least you would be compassionate enough then to, separate rats who are going to be decapitated from rats who are watching this happen. So practical applications like that, I think are important. And, for interacting with our dogs and cats, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a dog owner who doesn't think that dogs have a sense of empathy. But knowing that, I think we can be careful in what we expose them to, and just taking their feelings into account in daily interactions with them. So.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I would like to ask you now, because at a certain point in your book, Wild Justice, you say that parental care and communal nursing, at least you use those two examples, are not in themselves moral behaviors. Could you explain that? And I'm asking you this because I've already talked with a lot of evolutionary psychologists and biologists who do work on animal morality, and they tend to start from things like, for example, kin selection and how animals might have evolved some emotions first for mothers to nurse their infants, and then perhaps also in species where there's a high parental investment on the part of males, also for males to do that, and then perhaps over time other mechanisms piggybacked on those emotions to expand the range of individuals towards whom they would direct those same sorts of emotions. So, from a biological / evolutionary perspective, people also tend to classify these types of behaviors as moral behaviors, right?
Yeah, I think so. The way I would process, I think the definition given is absolutely right, and I agree with that completely. And so you have this much broader subset of pro-social behaviors, or behaviors that promote reproductive success, genetic success, including parental care and communal nursing, and at least the way that we viewed it in Wild Justice, then there's a smaller subset of animals who possess a certain level of, neural complexity, complex cognitive capacities. So, and I think that's so those species would also likely have, I can't think of examples of animals who we say have moral behaviors who don't also have parental care and some kind of shared nursing or shared raising of young. But it's a broader group of species in which you'd see those more basic pro-social behaviors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, and with all of this in mind, how should we approach the development of moral and legal status for other animals? Should we go with a case-by-case scenario and perhaps evaluate each animal or each species in a case-by-case basis, or perhaps attribute a general moral and legal status to all animal species?
Yes, both. I mean, I think, again, if you're going to, I guess the way I would answer that question, it's obviously a really multi-layered question and really complex. But so on the moral side, I think our intuition is to pay the most attention to the feelings or needs of animals with high levels of intellectual and emotional complexity. And I think that makes some sense, so that you pay more attention to what's happening to a pig or a dog than to a bee or an ant. And I think those kind of distinctions, or that intuition, it makes a lot of sense. And I think we do need to go down that path to a certain extent. But I also think, as I suggested before, that it's got its problems too, because then we're sort of highlighting the things that matter to us and that are important to us. And those may not track on to what's important to animals. And I think you could say for animals and any living thing, what they value most highly is their own life. So I think we can start with that as a principle to kind of guide what we're doing. And I like to think about it myself, or sort of the way I approach my own moral thinking about animals is to begin with the principle of nonviolence or non-harm, because I think all animals have an interest in not being harmed and in not having suffering imposed on them and not having their life taken from them. And I think that can get you pretty far, because then, you sort of can base your personal decisions and political decisions on how to minimize your negative impact. And it's impossible to live without imposing harm on each other and on other creatures. It's just it's an ideal, but it's not possible to do no harm at all, but you can work to minimize it. And I think, an example of that is, if you live in an area of the world where you can have access to vegan, nutritious, affordable vegan food, why not do it? Because it's an easy way to minimize the amount of harm that you're doing. And, I could give a whole range of examples of, where the things that we often do are not really necessary for our survival or well-being even. And, we can make choices, little choices and big choices that reduce harm.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's go through some of those examples. Let's start with perhaps animal research and testing in science. Because, as you were saying, one of the main goals would be to try to minimize as much as possible harm that is done on other animals in this case, because we don't really use humans to do research and testing in science, or at least it is very confined, let's say, and let's put it that way. So when it comes to this topic, animal research and testing in science, what do you think should we add to the models that we already have nowadays, if we are to try to reduce harm that is done on animals even further?
I think the ultimate goal should be to stop using animals. And I have no illusions that that's going to happen tomorrow. But I think if we really were going to put money and energy into establishing alternatives, it would and could happen, and probably fairly rapidly. And I think that would be a good way to go. And there are, I think, some promising opportunities with animals like dogs, where our relationship is companionable for the most part. I mean, there are dogs who live in laboratories as research subjects, but there's a lot of really interesting medical research being done with family pets, and it's voluntary research. The animals are not harmed. They're given, I mean, they're basically, we're learning from treating our dogs and treating their diseases, learning about how these diseases work in humans and how treatments work. And so this kind of comparative or One Health approach, where the research really can be non-invasive and voluntary, and it benefits everybody. It's not just, it's not just us imposing an agenda on other animals. So that's where I would like to see things go.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but I guess that perhaps this is a little... Mm-hmm. Okay, but I guess that perhaps this is a little bit complicated, not only because it is very difficult for us to develop good enough alternatives to animal models, particularly when it comes to perhaps testing drugs and things like that. But on the other hand, isn't it also the case that even for us to learn more about other animals' behavior and even specifically about how their morality works, that, I mean, it's very difficult for us to do it exclusively with them in the wild, right? So there are really things that for us to be certain of what we're studying here, it has to be done in a controlled environment, and that really implies that we have to catch some of them and put them in a lab or a cage to test them, right?
Well, so I think the idea that the lab is a controlled environment is a little bit, like, I don't quite agree with that. I mean, there are so many variables in the lab, and I think what scientists are discovering is that there are a lot more variables than we even thought. Variables like stress, which can really throw research results off. And probably a lot of the animal research that has been done in the past isn't all that reliable because there are a lot of variables. The effect of temperature on mice, the effect of noise, the effect of confinement, the effect of having another mouse in the cage or not having another mouse in the cage. There's so many variables, so it's not a controlled environment. I think that's a myth. So to justify doing research because it's a controlled environment, I think, is a little disingenuous. We tend to get a lot better information about the behavior of wild animals if we study them in the wild. Behavior in captivity is altered in so many ways by captivity. And I think you make a good point, that we probably can't know as much, but maybe that's okay. Maybe the price of knowledge is too high if it involves inflicting this massive suffering on animals. And I think a case that I find interesting and also perplexing morally is the research that Jaak Panksepp did on rats. He learned a tremendous amount about emotional behavior in rats and more broadly in other animals, and really was one of the people who helped us understand that animals have emotions. So this profoundly important work, but it was very, it's invasive research on rats. So to study whether they feel empathy or whether they laugh when they're tickled, you kill them and cut their brains open. So it's tricky. I mean, there's no doubt that the information that he gave to us of huge benefit to us and to animals, but I don't know. It's problematic too. I don't think there's a good answer to your question. This is why ethicists have jobs, right?
Right.
Low paying jobs, but jobs nonetheless.
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah. Okay, and what is your position when it comes to animal conservation, when it's done in places like zoos and aquaria? Because there are really lots of people, even scientists, and one of the that come to mind easily is Jane Goodall, for example,
Right.
that really defend having zoos and other places like that to conserve certain animal species. But,
Yeah.
but what might be some of the problems with that?
So that's another one of these issues that can keep you up at night, because zoos are deeply problematic, and yet they may be the only way that some species are going to survive. So one response is to really, right now a lot of zoos function like Disneyland. They're not conservation centers, they're amusement parks. And the focus is on amusement, not on conservation. And they use conservation as an excuse to provide the amusement and to make a lot of money. And legitimately, some of the money that's made from that amusement does funnel back into conservation. So it does benefit species. I think you couldn't deny that. But the primary focus of zoos, for the most part right now, is not conservation. It's entertainment. And if you were going to, I think, make zoos really about the animals and about conservation, you would remove or at least alter in serious ways that entertainment element of it. I think, wild sanctuaries where animals are in more, not just naturalistic enclosures, which is what zoos, the terminology they use to describe like a concrete tree for a climbing animal is a naturalistic enclosure. But to actually give animals space, real wild land, hopefully, preferably in an ecosystem that they're actually adapted for, and make it about actually conserving species. That would be a move in the right direction. And, some zoos are a lot better and closer to achieving that than others. And I think one thing that I've written in the Animals Agenda and in some other places is just that there are probably some species who simply cannot thrive in zoos and shouldn't be there. And elephants are the primary example. They don't have enough space. It just can't be done well. Bears, I think, are another example. It's just they're too wide-ranging. They're too socially complex. So, in a situation like that where keeping an animal in captivity is really just an infliction of daily suffering, maybe allowing a species to go extinct is the better thing for that species. I don't know. That's a question that I can't answer, but again, that's the sort of thing that would keep you up at night, especially with climate change kind of squeezing animals from all sides. You see these mass extinctions going on, and the urge to save and conserve. Maybe rather than building zoos, we should try to save wild forests. There may be, and we need to do that both perhaps, but maybe our priorities are slightly in the wrong place.
Right. But do you think that at least at this point in history and taking into account the conditions that we have and the circumstances we live in and also perhaps what people are really willing to do or to invest in these sorts of things, that zoos and aquaria and things like that are still a net positive for animals or not?
I'm not sure how to answer. I'm not sure they are. I think if you ask the individual animals living in the zoos, that would be the way to get the answer. And I'm not sure. It's hard to say. Some zoos and aquaria are quite nice, and the conditions are quite good. And there are a lot of places that call themselves zoos that are really just awful torture chambers for animals. And I think that one of the questions that really would be good to answer is, do zoos encourage people or help people to understand and care about animals and nature? And I think the jury is really out on that. There's no good evidence that they do. I'd be willing to wait for new studies. I don't think any of the studies are really good enough to give a clear answer. But I suspect that the education that children get at a zoo is much less useful than going to the park and watching squirrels.
Yes, right. Okay, and earlier in the interview you referred briefly to veganism. So I would also like to ask you about what is your position on the food industry? Because on the one hand, some people make the case that perhaps it is really too unrealistic to expect for at least a considerable percentage of people to move on to plant-based diets, let's say. But on the other hand, we're also developing good enough alternatives, I guess, like lab meat or meat grown in the lab, right? And the price of it is going down over time, so perhaps in the very near future we will have viable commercial versions of it, let's say. So with all of that in mind, what would you say would be, from a ethical perspective, the best approach to have to the food industry?
Well, do you mean specifically the animal agriculture industry?
Yes.
So, I think they obviously have a vested interest in telling us we need to eat meat to be healthy, which I think is a scam, personally. That gets really political really fast, though. And I think, on this issue, I'd be really careful not to be judgmental toward people and the individual choices they make, because a lot of people think really carefully about what they eat and why. And a lot of people, the majority of people, still choose to eat meat. I think for animals and for the planet, for climate change reasons, shifting to more plants and fewer animal proteins is the way to go. I think the argument based on the needs of sort of our planetary needs for survival and climate impact, that alone, I think, makes a compelling case for being largely plant-based in one's eating habits in most places of the world. And I know it's not feasible everywhere, and it's not feasible for everyone. But I think I I think there's a lot of, at least in the U.S., the meat lobby is extremely powerful, and they have a very strong influence over nutritional guidelines and advice, and even over what doctors tell their patients, and what we hear about what a healthy diet looks like, and there's also a lot of, I call it humane washing, this attempt to make us feel better about consuming animal proteins by saying, well, these cows, pictures of smiling cows on the side of the milk carton, and these cows were humanely raised and slaughtered, or, well, they don't use the, I don't know if I've ever seen the word slaughter on a piece of, milk or meat in the dairy aisle. But, I think I can't think of any compelling reasons not to move toward a more plant-based diet.
Mm-hmm. So even if we didn't have the environmental issues, just from a purely animal welfare perspective, and in trying to minimize as much as we can animal suffering, it would still be a good enough case to try to eliminate meat and other animal products from our diets as much as possible, right?
I think so, yeah. Mm-hmm. I think if you were an animal who was a participant in the meat industry, you would be very happy to have people choose not to go that direction. Their lives, for the most part, are brutal and short and unpleasant, and their deaths are also not pretty. So I think you can't humane wash the suffering away.
Mm-hmm. Right. And when it comes specifically to lab-grown meat, do you think that, in terms of meat, of course, because it doesn't really substitute for other types of animal products, do you think that that would be a good enough alternative from an ethical perspective, or are there something problematic there as well?
Well, I'm not sure about the whole lab-grown meat thing. I mean, it seems like a huge investment of energy and money to figure out how to make something that is non-essential. Like and I know a lot of people will disagree with me on this point, but I don't think that meat is an essential part of a healthy human diet. You can get protein in other ways. Now, one of the trendy things now, and one of the things that people thinking about food security seem to see as a good possibility is the eating insects. And, you can say, well, that's preferable because they have less capacity for suffering or less sentient or whatever, as we may discover 10 years down the line or 20 years down the line that there's more going on for insects than not, but that may be a viable protein source as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so if we were to at least reduce the consumption of animal products derived from at least mammals, let's say, and birds, that would already be good enough, at least for the time being.
I think it'd be a great start. It'd be a fantastic start. And this is one of those areas where I think we have a tremendous room for improvement. Even if people committed to 1 day a week of not eating animal products, that would be a huge benefit. Or 2 days a week, or go 90% vegan. and not 100%, just 90%. And I think it'd be better for people's health too. But again, that's, I know, an area that is very political, and a lot of people would disagree with me on that point. But I know a lot of very happy, healthy vegans.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that what you just told us is what some people nowadays call a reducitarian approach, right?
Right. And I think it makes a lot of sense, because, you know, as we all know, it's hard to change your habits, and eating habits are really deeply ingrained, and they're very emotional. And I have friends who insist to me that they don't feel good when they eat totally vegan, and you know, I have to say that may be true for them. So, you know, to say everybody needs to become vegan tomorrow is, I think, a little bit over the top. But it's something that we can all work toward, again, going on the principle of sort of reducing the level of harm that we impose in whatever small ways we can is a good thing. And it's a struggle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes, right. Okay, so Dr. Pierce, I know that you have a book, a new book coming out somewhere in the near future that is called Dog's World, I think, and where you explore what might happen to dogs if humans were to disappear from the world, if we were to go extinct or something like that. So could you tell us about that book, the types of issues that you are going to explore there and things like that?
Sure, yeah. And it's a stretch to say it's almost coming out because we just started, so we have a lot of work to do.
Okay.
So I do actually have a book coming out in about a month called Unleashing Your Dog, which is another collaboration with Marc Bekoff, and we can talk about that one if you want to. But this, our working title of this new book is A Dog's World, as you said, and this is a book that I'm working on with Marc Bekoff. Again, this is our fourth book together, so a very fruitful collaboration. And yeah, it's kind of a thought experiment. You know, what would happen to two dogs if humans just disappeared? And you know, what you often hear is this kind of throwaway line people will make about their little Chihuahua Fluffy. Oh, she would never survive without me. And it's funny, now that we've started working on this book, I've had my ear open for this kind of comment, and it happens a lot. People just making these assumptions about dogs being unable to survive without their human partners, and it just it kind of gets you thinking about, you know, would they actually? And one of the things that motivated this book was another book that we both read by Alan Weissman called A World Without Us. That it's a really interesting book. I recommend it. And he basically, he's a science journalist, and he looks at specifically what would happen to the world if humans were to go away. And for example, you know, what would happen to your house? How long would it take for your house to disintegrate? And which parts of it, you know, the tiles in your bathroom might be around for 1 million years, but, you know, your roof would be gone in 50, this sort of thing. And it's a really interesting book. And he has one line in there about dogs, basically says, well, dogs would just disappear. And, you know, I think that's actually not true. They probably would survive quite well without us. And one of the statistics that I find really interesting is that about 85% of the dogs on the planet are actually not owned pets. They are living on their own now, and they do quite well. You know, feral dogs, street dogs, It's all these different groups and kind of communities of dogs living independently of humans or semi-independently. And that's one of the questions we're looking at is, they do actually rely pretty strongly on humans for food resources, for, scavenging from waste dumps or whatnot. And, if those sources of food dried up, what would they eat? So we're looking at some, it's all speculative, but some biological questions. Would dogs revert back to something like wolves? Would they hybridize with coyotes or wolves? And based on what would you make those predictions? And they've been following this trajectory of domestication. What would it look like for them to undomesticate or de-domesticate? How would their appearance change? Would they all look sort of like dingoes, sort of medium-sized, red-colored? Based on what would you make that kind of prediction? And who would they eat? How would they catch them? Would Chihuahuas survive better than Great Danes because they're little and they need less food and maybe they can hide in small spaces? Or would they just get eaten by eagles or whatever? And part of it is to think about the question of what are natural behaviors for dogs, because it's actually sort of a hard question to answer. Who are dogs really? And they're such an artifact of our interventions that it's hard to know which behaviors are really natural to them and important to them, and which behaviors would help them thrive in the future and which might harm them. So it's going to be an interesting project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I hope.
And will you also explore perhaps what domestication made to dogs in terms of, for example, their anatomy? Because I know that there are at least some dogs that really, because of the way they evolved by way of artificial selection, they really suffer a lot because of the ways their anatomy changed, right?
Yes, and that's one of the questions that's motivating the book is, what have we created? And I think the example you're probably getting at are the short-nosed dogs, the brachycephalic breeds.
Right.
And I think I've seen 5 articles in the last week in veterinary journals about various health problems that these dogs have. They have problems giving birth. They have problems breathing, obviously. They die early. And, I think that's an example. If you can say, well, those breeds would certainly die out within 50 years. I'm just speculating here, but maybe that suggests that we have done some mischief to them, morally speaking, in sort of creating animals that can't survive on their own, and that live with these disabilities. And so which aspects of breeding and artificial selection are beneficial for dogs and which are harmful. So hopefully untangling some of those threads. Is it healthier and better to be a dog who looks more like a wolf than like a pug?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so at least we can say, I guess, that dogs wouldn't completely go extinct, but at least some of them, they are already too unadapted, let's say, to natural environments because of the ways we change them.
I think so, yeah. And dogs, I think just taking the example of dogs who are currently living on their own, they do pretty well. You know, they know how to forage, and it's interesting to study. You know, the tendency, at least in the U.S., is, you know, the dog is an extension of the human person, and this is the kind of the key social relationship, and the thing that the dog really cares about is they're human. But when you look at, you know, feral dog communities, you know, they actually form packs. It's interesting to see, and have some hierarchical structures the way wolf packs do. So they do seem to retain this ancestral memory, if you will, of how to live with each other without us in the equation. So, and, you know, on the other hand, there's been some really interesting research in the past couple years on the social cognition of dogs and how they have evolved these mechanisms for communicating specifically with humans. You know, they are really good at following human gaze and pointing gestures, even pointing with our feet. They're really good at paying attention to the signals that we're giving, and they have their own ways of communicating with us, like barking. You know, wolves don't really bark, or very rarely, and it's not a key part of their communication strategy. But for dogs, it is with us. Barking is really for humans, and so it's very interesting to speculate about what would happen to these social cognitive capacities that have evolved, you know, for them to communicate with us. If we're out of the equation, will they repurpose those to communicate with each other, with the family cat? I don't know. So, yeah.
Okay. So, Dr. Pierce, would you also like to give us a short teaser to your next book? As you said, that will be out next month, which is titled Unleashing Your Dog, right?
Yes, it's called Unleashing Your Dog, and it's really a practical guide for dog owners on how to give your dog the best life you can, using what we know right at this point in time, and we'll know a lot more tomorrow and next week. But right now, the sort of current state of canine science, and the way we approach it is through the five senses of the dog. So, you know, smell, sight, hearing, touch. What's the other one? Hearing, touch. Anyway, five senses. I can't think of the fifth one. And, you know, how do dogs experience the world through these different sensory modes? And how is it different from the way we experience the world? You know, what do they see that we don't see, or what do they not see so well? You know, what sounds can they hear that we can't hear? And the reason it's important is, you know, just to take that example of hearing, you know, there's some suggestion that technology in our homes is really driving our dogs crazy, because there are a lot of high-pitched sounds that we can't hear that emanate from all of these devices that we have, but that may be difficult for our dogs, you know, there's sort of constant exposure to high-pitched noises. So, and then the example that I gave early on in the conversation about, you know, when you take your dog for a walk, letting your dog smell as much as possible, because that's really how, like, when I take Bella for a walk, that's her reading the newspaper, is stopping to, you know, see who's been there and what they've been up to, and the neighborhood gossip. And the title of the book, Unleashing Your Dog, really we mean quite literally too. It's metaphorical, but also, you know, dogs need to be able to just run free and be dogs. And, you know, they need to do things that dogs do, like sniff each other's butts, which we get all upset about sometimes as humans, because it's, you know, in our culture, it's not a polite thing to do. But to say, this is a way dogs gather information about each other, and we need to not be squeamish about it, and just let them be dogs. Let them, they're not little people. They're a different animal. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, Dr. Pierce, apart from what we've been talking about and those two books, are there any online sources where people can go to if they want to learn a little bit more about your work?
So, my website has links to some of my articles. It's just jessicapierce.net. And I have a Psychology Today blog. So there are a bunch of essays on that. I think the title of the blog site is All Dogs Go to Heaven, and it's sort of specifically about end-of-life care and dogs and also cats. But there are all sorts of essays on there. So those are probably, I would say, the two top places to go for just easily accessible information.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I will be leaving links to all of that and also the rest of your work in the description box of the video, Dr. Pierce. And so I would really like to thank you again for taking the time to be here with us today. It was really a very interesting conversation. So.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
Hi there, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started my channel last year and I've been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would really like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there, or alternatively you can also do it on PayPal or Subscribestar. I will leave all the links in the description box. Otherwise, if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons Karen Litske, Anne Blanchett, Perelga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, and my first producer, Izar Webb. Thank you for